Well, welcome back to On Gravel, episode 7.
Shotgun!
Well, good afternoon, gents. You know,
Are you going to acknowledge my calling shotgun or not?
Yeah, I was going to. All right. You opened up the old box. So every podcast worth its salt has a snazzy, hook 'em up and don't let 'em go jingle. And, we thought we'd get with the times and do it ourselves. And so we did.
And here it is.
Between where you're sitting right now and the place you're happiest likely lies a gravel road. Sometimes the drive is as much fun as the destination. And this is one trip where everyone can call shotgun. So hop in the truck with your hosts Andrew McKean, Ryan Bronson, and Eric Dinger, and let's hit the road. Welcome to the On Gravel Podcast. On Gravel Podcast.
So again, shotgun.
Explanations in order.
Anyone can call shotgun on this road trip.
Between the place where you spend your dismal life and the place you want to be, likely lies a gravel road. So Dinger is responsible for every single part of that, with the exception of the line about calling shotgun, which I'm happy to claim. But what the hell happened?
Well, first of all, we sent it into the internet, and the internet came back with that. And I don't know about you guys, but I think it's so ridiculous that we got to keep it.
I kind of agree with you, but is irony going to be communicated to everybody?
No,
or is this who
some people will be like, these guys are cheesy morons, and they'll be right, but we don't want them to think that.
I think we need some feedback from the audience. Keep it or leave it or re-record it.
Well, how about we add to this question the outro that the same voice engineer sent us?
Do we have that?
Oh, we have it. Yeah, I'll play it now. Here you go.
Thank you for listening to the On Gravel Podcast. We hope you enjoyed today's show. If you did, make sure to drop us a follow and share the podcast with friends and family. Have a great day.
So I think we should probably change the logo for the podcast and just put a smiley face that says "Have a nice day" on it.
Maybe it could be one of the stoner happy faces.
Yeah, with the bandana on it.
And the kind of the crinkly smile.
Uh-huh. Well, we're off and running. On Gravel's back. What are we talking about today, Mr. McKean?
I think we're going to talk a little bit about where in the world I was last week. Then I think we owe it to our audience and to ourselves to talk about CWD for a little bit, since it's kind of a national conversation right now. And I think we're gonna go to mentoring a little bit, and Bronson has got the great dichotomous question of the day. But let's start with me. That's what I like to talk about.
Why wouldn't we?
Why wouldn't we? We've already established that I have the most dubious suspect job in the universe, which is that of an outdoor writer. Which I'll say about that is I call it participatory journalism, just to give it just a little edge. But it really means that we are always guests of somebody. And this last week, I was guest of Nosler Rifles and Ammunition in Utah. I'm really a do-it-yourself public land kind of hunter. That's where I cut my teeth. It's where I feel most at home. This was anything but that. It was on 250 acres of private land with the most ridiculous elk hunting of my life. It was like Yellowstone before the wolves. So that, number one, I felt a little bit like I was cheating. Number two, this, it's early September, mid-September. This is the height of the elk rut, archery season, and really most of the western states. I was hunting elk with a rifle during the rut, which seemed just like abject cheating. But I'll do it every chance I get. So anyway, I ended up shooting just an awesome elk. But the thing that made it a real hunt, because it was possible to just sort of dive into a aspen bowl and shoot the first elk you'd see and then go home. But what I started noticing is the real active bulls were younger. Raghorns, they were beautiful bulls, but they were a younger age class, 3 and 4 year old bulls, just absolutely running in a frenzy, trying to gather cows into harems, and then half the bulls were trying to take cows away from the other bulls. It was just a circus. But I noticed that, where are the older age class of bulls? What I noticed is they were not participating in this frenzy of the rut. They were pulled back, kind of off stage. We would hear every now and then just these deep, gravelly, gnarly bugles and growls of older bulls, but they really didn't show themselves until the very last bit of light. And we had heard the bull I ended up shooting a couple of times, and tried to move in on it and keep the wind right in case it did emerge from cover. And finally it did, about 700 yards away, and we cut the distance to 400. I was worried that we were going to lose light. I didn't want to take a shot that long, so I had to kind of bail off down a big canyon, then up the other side, and finally got in about 200 yards away and made a shot and got him. But we lost light. One of the interesting things about being an outdoor writer is content is what drives everything we do, whether it's photography or the words that we use to describe our experiences. And one of the problems with shooting an animal at the very last bit of failing light is it's hard to get good photographs. A couple of my peers had shot bulls at the very end of last light, and they propped them up on the hillside and came back the next day for full light photography. But the problem with that is it's September in Utah, and it was getting pretty hot in the daytime, and it really wasn't cooling down a lot at night. The risk of that is losing meat from these big bulls. They retain a lot of body heat, and if you don't get the skin off of them and get them quartered, you're going to lose meat. So I had a big decision to make. Just a beautiful, beautiful photogenic bull, but I wasn't about to leave him out overnight. So we cut him up, decked all the quarters out on sagebrush so he could cool down, and then hiked out that night and came back the next day and retrieved all the meat. But I don't have a lot of photographs to show for it, but that's okay. It was a great week.
So tell us about this bull.
Well, he's a dandy. He's a big 6x6. A lot of people ask me, well, what's your favorite animal to hunt? And I often default to mule deer because I love mule deer. I love where they live. They're kind of a critter that's in need of some conservation care and careful handling. Elk can kind of make it anywhere, but I don't know. I love hunting elk almost as much as mule deer. I've hunted them enough. I kind of have in my mind's eye what a perfect bull looks like, and this bull comes really close. He's got unbelievable front. So the first tines off of his brow are like 14, 15 inches and just heavy as spears. And then his fourth points are these big sword blades that are, I don't know, 20, 22, 25 inches. I haven't measured them, but he is just a stud. He's got these gigantic fifth and sixth points, the big whale tail, they call them. He's got mass that just goes all the way out his rack. So I don't know if he's the highest scoring bull of my life, but he's probably just the most beautiful bull of my life.
We'll have to share a photo of that. We'll actually put it behind our logo on the podcast thing so people can see at least a little bit of this big old boy.
Maybe put it back.
That was a fun text to get.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, I told these boys I would let them know how I did. It was a great week. Great week.
So on these rider hunts, you say you're the guest of everybody. What is, like, why would a brand invite riders out to do something like an elk hunt in a place like that? What do they get?
It's like a really good question. So it depends on the rider, and it depends a little on the relationship. A lot of people ask that, and these brands. So this is a $12,000 elk hunt, and more than that by the time everything's said and done, with between travel and tipping guides and all that business. So it's a high dollar deal. So obviously there's expectations of a return on that kind of investment. It helps to understand kind of what the baseline is. So a full page ad in a national magazine like Outdoor Life or Field and Stream, it can be high five figures, so $20,000 to $40,000 for a full page ad. So a lot of brands will sort of say, well, a brand is our message, but savvy consumers tend to ignore ads an awful lot of the time. In an effort to get more eyeballs on either a new product or at least on that brand, it's a pretty smart play to invite a writer out to use that product, have a good experience, and then write about it. Often the feature stories will be 6 or 8 pages in a national magazine. And so, a $12,000 investment in getting a writer out in the field uh, that has 8 pages of content behind it with kind of first person content from the writer can can play pretty well in terms of promoting a brand or a product. And so that's kind of the expectation. My take on it has always been I've never felt comfortable promising content from a trip. To me, the story is the story, and it's hard to anticipate what that's going to be before you go. That being said, I've shot this great elk with a Nosler Model 48 long range carbon. So that's also part and parcel of the story, is how I did it and the gear I used. And so I'm certain that any content that comes out of this is obviously going to mention Nosler in a pretty good light. And it was a great experience. So that's kind of what they get out of it. They get that participatory journalism. And the other thing is, I got to hang out with John Nosler and Jeff Sipe, who's a recent hire to run their rifle division. So it's good for a relationship perspective as well.
So if I may, and I don't mean to make this an Andrew McKean interrogation, but one of the things that fascinates me about the job of editor of a magazine is that it's not all that different than producer of a TV show or developer of an app, in that you've got some eyeballs, and in exchange for their attention, you're going to provide them something. And you want to maintain some degree of editorial credibility and some control over, not making your thing the next commercial that they're forced to watch. How do you walk that line, and maybe offer some thoughts about, some things you learned about stepping too far across the line to becoming, a paid commercial versus maybe an anecdote or two about times when you thought you did it right, or when people that you've seen do it right, did it right.
And related to that, Eric, when he's done, I've got a story about a time when an outdoor media source invited me on a hunt and how that went. So I think that's a good juxtaposition.
I think the far end of it is easy to see, and that's sort of the bought and the paid for celebrity. So the branded celebrity who's wearing kind of the decals all the time, or the camouflage pattern of the company, and it's part of their professional identity. That really becomes almost a paid pitchman or a spokesperson for that company. And I think savvy consumer sees through that. They're not going to say anything critical about the product or that brand. Outdoor writers and outdoor communicators, if they're doing their job correctly, can participate in an experience like this, but not be sort of pitchmen or hawking that product. So you asked me how I kind of walk that line. To me, using the Utah hunt as an example, this is really about the place and the experience, not so much about the animal or the gear that was used to bring the animal to hand. Everybody has seen that video or the story, like, this is the best product I've ever used, that just hyperbolic pitching. And nobody believes that because it doesn't have any of the backstory or context. So if I'm doing my job right, I'm providing the context of, hunting elk in the rut is a singular experience. We happen to be using this product, but it has nothing to do with that. It's just that's almost a inclusion in imagery, but it's hardly about any brand. It's about the experience in this landscape that allows a hunter to access hundreds of thousands of acres of bugling elk during the rut. If I'm doing my job right, I want to transport my audience to where I was and hear the bugles, hear that deep growl, have that sort of tension and uncertainty of how it's going to end.
Bronson, how did yours go?
So there's a major outdoor publication that Andrew may have some experience with that invited me to go on this multi-stage hunt a couple of years ago. And unlike how it normally goes, where the private companies and the PR guys that work for the companies organize the hunts, this actually got set up by an editor of a publication or an online publication. And so I went and met him in western Minnesota. So it was a fairly short drive for me. and they scheduled it, and it was originally going to be a duck hunt, and we get there, and there weren't any ducks. I mean, we were in the donut hole of the season. There were no ducks, and the outfitter that was there didn't have a lot of secondary options, and so we're sitting there looking at empty skies and trying to generate some content. And we happened to be in a town where I knew uh, a guy that did some work with pheasants forever. So I called him up. He owns a brewery. It's called Bank Brewing, and they make beer for wildlife is what it's called. So I called him up. He was in town. I said, hey, can we come down and meet you at your tasting room? We went there. He gave us a tour. And in the process, he invited us to go hunting the next day on his property that he managed for pheasants. Well, we had an epic pheasant hunt, which I pointed out to the member of the media that was organizing the hunt that he didn't arrange that. I did. And had a little bit of fun with him. But we generated some good content. And then the next day we had a spot where they had found some ducks, and it was on a state wildlife management area. And to get to the spot where the ducks were on this wildlife area, we had to put on our waders, and it was hot. It was 70 some degrees, and we had to hike through these cattails all the way across this wildlife management area and kind of hunt along the border on the west side. Well, we get all the way over there, hauling all our gear. We get it all set up, and a truck comes driving up and parks on the fence line about 60 yards from where we're setting up, and parks there and crosses the fence and comes over and informs us that we're not allowed to hunt there, that it's public land, or that it's private land, and that we didn't have permission. And I pull out my app with my powder hook app that shows the lines and everything. I said, well, no, where you parked over there is the fence line. That's the edge of the property. You can see we're on the public land. And he insisted that it was not public, that it was private. We didn't have permission, and that he was calling the sheriff. And I kind of wanted to talk to the sheriff because, I have zero doubt that we were on public land, but it wasn't my hunt. I hadn't organized it. I didn't do anything related to it. And so our guys got mad, including our media member a little bit. And I ended up, just said, guys, look, it isn't worth the conflict for me. I'm going to head back. You guys do what you want to do. So we all headed back. And so we get back, and I pulled out the maps, and I pulled out a different mapping app and looked at it and confirmed that where we were at was on public land. So the one time that I went on a hunt that was organized by a media member, I got kicked off of public land.
So have a nice day.
Yeah.
Have a nice day.
So, but then I packed everything up and I drove west, and I drove out to Fort Pierre and met Andrew, and we went. He had an RV on that trip. I don't remember what all he was doing, but we watched the World Series on a big screen TV out in the middle of nowhere in the grasslands of the Fort Pierre grasslands. And the next day we went and killed a couple of chickens and had a good morning hunt and had a good time. But that whole hunt started out with the important thing that I wanted to communicate is, see, organizing these hunts for the media is not that easy. There's a lot of things that can go wrong, and every single one of them seemed to go wrong on that one.
Well, I'd like to remind you that the grasslands was also put together and planned by a member of the media. The fact that you couldn't hit a chicken, I think, stings a little bit.
I'm not bitter about that, although the way that you guys filmed me and depicted it made me look like an idiot in your video. I'm a little bitter about that.
It's amazing you think it takes a videographer to make you look like an idiot.
No, I'm perfectly capable of making myself look like an idiot, but so they send me out with a cameraman, and I'm supposed to be the blocker. One guy blocking 80 square miles of escape routes for these chickens. And when they took off and they flew, a good 150 yards away from where I was standing. So I did what a smart Minnesota Jack Pine Savage is going to do. I took off sprinting across the prairie, hoping that the last bird in the flock might get up and fly within range. And I did get close enough to take a long Hail Mary shot at 60 yards and didn't get the bird. And that, that was disappointing, but it's fine. But then, so I had to run several hundred yards across this prairie to get to that spot. And the cameraman that they sent with me is this marathon runner. So 200 yards for him is not a big deal, but 200 yards at full out sprint for me, look, I'm a little chubby. Not going to lie. I get there and I got the shot off, and then the way he filmed it, and then more to the way he edited it, it made it look like I ran like 20 feet and was out of breath and couldn't shoot because I was out of breath. And that was not the case. I made a wonderful 70-yard poke at a prairie chicken and dropped a leg but couldn't recover it.
So I'm not good at a lot of things, but you started 150 yards away. You ended up taking a 70-yard shot, and the difference between 150 and 70 is not a couple hundred yards as far as my math goes, A. And so, B, how were you so tired after an 80-yard jog?
I wasn't that tired, but I was huffing and puffing from sprinting that far. And first of all, it was not. What you need to understand, Eric, is that when a bird sees this guy, this 6 foot, 220 pound Norwegian running across the prairie in blaze orange, they kind of shift over a little bit farther.
They give you the have a nice day?
Yeah.
All right. By the way, 220 might be generous, but
okay. Well, yeah. I'm pushing 230 probably now. But so, did I mention the fact that we killed several bottles of rye whiskey the night before?
Yeah, I thought that might have something to do with it.
I was.
By the way, well, you are always fine because you have the metabolism of an Ethiopian. The thing that happened that trip, I wasn't invited on this trip. It was called Willow's Last Ride, wasn't it?
It was.
Andrew? No, wait, I was invited, but I had a different trip. Maybe I was like the token last minute invite. I don't know exactly how it went. But you guys were drinking Rendezvous Rye from High West, and you sent a picture of that, and I went and bought a bottle of it, and now it's my favorite. So influencer marketing apparently worked because you never said anything about it. But here's the assumption you have to make. When people travel that far for a hunt as important as their dog's last ride, they're not bringing the crappy bottle of whiskey. Fair statement?
We had a pretty good time. So we actually, as Bronson mentioned, we had a RV. It was kind of a small one, but it was me and my buddy Mark Copenhaver and photographer Bill Buckley, and of course the lady of the moment, my yellow lab Willow. My Uncle Ken from Chicago came. We were actually on our way to go see the family homestead in western South Dakota. But he is a big Chicago Cub fan. I know you are too, Dinger. But seeing that this was the deciding game of the World Series, watching it out on the prairie on this big screen, big television screen on the side of the RV, drunk to the gills on good rye whiskey and a beautiful purple sky, Camp Chef stuff everywhere, eating great food with great people and good dogs was one of the great hunting highlights of my life.
I can imagine. Well, I'm up for it again whenever you're ready. Maybe we should come up with a story about the 3 different colored labs getting to hunt together for the first time as an excuse for getting to do it again.
Well, I've heard a rumor that Uncle Ken is interested in coming back.
He is. We're thinking about doing it. Well, maybe we got a November rendezvous with the rye.
So if you're listening to this show and at all times during the fall you're not threatening to plan more hunts, you're probably doing it wrong. A. B, knowing that as soon as your wife catches wind of the fact that you're planning another hunt, your happiness at home quotient is going to go down. Your marital bank account already being drained, of course, because of all the hunting that you're planning to do this fall, means the net of your conversation here is basically verbal masturbation. It's probably not going to happen, but it sure sounds fun.
Well, I think we've teed up our dichotomous question of the day. Really, we're just why put it off anymore? We've kind of walked that tension between biscuits or cornbread, between flavored or unflavored sunflower seeds. Bronson, do you want to establish the question of the day?
So I live in Minnesota. Have I mentioned that yet this episode? And we border on our western side, both North and South Dakota. And I love the Dakotas. Love them both. They're wonderful places to visit. They're wonderful places to hunt. But I think it's imperative for every hunter, especially an upland hunter, to, to to put a stake in the sand and declare that truly North Dakota is the superior state to South Dakota when it comes to hunting.
So before I get into the obvious answer, I just want to make an observation, and that is that to a Minnesotan, North Dakota looks an awful lot like Denmark looks to a Norwegian, just country to invade. And if you look at like all of the regulations that North Dakota has passed, we've got split duck seasons, and it's really all of an attempt to keep Minnesotans out of the state. I feel like you've ruined it for the rest of us.
Well, that's absolutely true. They call us blue platers because that's the color of our license plates. But in this era, when we're trying to recruit new hunters, I want to point out Minnesota is a state that exports hunters. We will send hunters to any state in the union to hunt, and so we're trying to make hunting great again. But so here, before I ever hunted South Dakota, I hunted North Dakota, and I had the pleasure of hunting in the Dakotas in the early 2000s before the war on non-residents occurred. And yes, it's true that it was largely aimed at Minnesotans. But my experience in rural North Dakota is that they hate people from Fargo more than they hate people from Minnesota. It's just hard to write a law that excludes people from a city as opposed to excluding people from a state. But now, while they limit how much time I can spend hunting waterfowl in the state of North Dakota, they don't make me go through a ridiculous lottery to be able to do it. South Dakota, in order to hunt ducks in South Dakota, you have to go through a lottery, and it's pretty restrictive, and so you've got that. North Dakota, no lottery, over the counter. You can hunt up to 2 weeks in that state as a non-resident. It is a huge duck producing state. There's a ton of public land. Their walk-in program, the plots program, is spectacular. North Dakotans, both East River and West River are great people. So are South Dakotans, but the South Dakota legislature keeps me from hunting waterfowl there every year, and that disappoints me. And I am disappointed that there's so many farm-raised birds that are released into South Dakota to boost their numbers for so many locations. You don't find that in North Dakota. When you hunt birds, upland birds in North Dakota, those are almost guaranteed to be wild birds that grew up on the grasslands of that wonderful prairie state. And so I love them both. Don't get me wrong. It's like child A and child B, but North Dakota is my favorite.
Well, I'm gonna interject here before the South Dakota native weighs in. You make good points, and I think the farm raised bird quotient is something that bothers me just a little bit. So I'm gonna give you a couple of points there. But just in terms of geographical variety, I think in terms of genuineness of the people, and I would say maybe diversity of the people, South Dakota's got North Dakota beat by just a little bit. There's a little bit of a demographic sameness about North Dakota. I'm not saying it's bad or wrong. It's just kind of bland and the same, which I understand you could kind of see yourself amongst those people there, Bronson. But I have roots in South Dakota. My great grandfather homesteaded there. He was actually from Wahpeton, North Dakota, I'll have you know. So he kind of straddled the line. And in fact, when he homesteaded pretty close to the North Dakota border, actually on the Standing Rock Indian Reservation. So in some ways, you could say it's neither north nor south. But I just think between hunting deer and turkeys and the whole variety of upland birds, waterfowl, there's an awful lot of diversity to South Dakota. Yeah, there's diversity to North Dakota, but I think there's more diversity to South Dakota. My granddad went to Yankton College, though, so that also influences me a little bit. All right, Dinger, bring it home.
Well, I think this is probably going to go without saying. I'm going to vote for South Dakota,
You lost
thus
on
making it
biscuits.
2-1, defeating Bronson yet again.
No, I was biscuits.
I did? I thought you were a cornbread. No. So when I moved to Nebraska, they taught me that North Dakota is referred to as North to Canada. The thing is, Bronson, they shoot all wild birds because no one wants to go there. Like everybody wants to go to South Dakota because the people are better, it's prettier, it's warmer, they don't have Minot. I mean, there's a lot of things to really love about South Dakota that North Dakota just doesn't have.
So be careful about Minot, because I want to remind you that Glasgow is a suburb of Minot.
Could you say the name of the town again?
Glasgow.
You got it kind of right.
Glasgow, I think he's like Ryan Klesko.
Glasgow. I don't know what it was. I can almost see Minot from here on a.
Well, if you stand up on the roof of your house, you probably can.
Minot is without question my least favorite place on the planet, and it has nothing to do with hunting. And indulge me, if you will, for just a second. But my freshman year of college did not go well, and we'll talk about this at some point down the road. But needless to say, my life was about to lose a academic scholarship. I was playing football, and my football career ended it was in Bismarck, in University of Mary in North Dakota. I don't like the whole state because of this. I'll just lay it out there. But University of Mary, I got drilled on a stupid end around quarterback pass, half, whatever it was. And I laid on the field. It was a turf field at the University of Mary. I think that's in Bismarck now that I say it. So I'm sorry, Minot. I didn't mean to say such rude things. Anyway, it was the most pain I'd ever been in, both emotionally and physically, as I laid there writhing around, screaming, wondering, why on God's earth am I laying during a blizzard on a football field in this godforsaken place? And I haven't been back since. So
especially since there were probably mallards galore flying around that stadium, because Bismarck is surrounded by some of the best waterfowl habitat in the world.
Yeah, well, that's true. It's hard to argue that. But all of my memories of North Dakota, I went to school at Concordia in Moorhead for a year. Every time I crossed the border, something bad happened. And so if for no other reason, I would vote South Dakota, except for the fact that the people are better and the hunting's better and it's prettier and stuff like that.
So basically, what you're telling us is that you were Johnny Manziel before Johnny was Johnny.
Yeah, like I was Johnny Manziel before it was ever cool. Like it was a train wreck. And we can talk more about that down the road, but pretty much I did freshman year as wrong as you could possibly draw it up. And there's a lot of good, funny stories that can come out of that, but we'll share those for we'll save those for a time down the road when the users decided whether they like us enough to hear our personal stories or not.
You know, I got a question. Does North or South Dakota have chronic wasting disease?
Well, funny you should mention that. I know North Dakota does. I think South Dakota does as well. I'm less sure about that.
I'm pretty sure they got it in the hills.
CWD has definitely been a national discussion, for years, but it seems like it's intensifying this year. But it's personal for me this year. We are in an intensive monitoring phase in northeast Montana, where I live. Last year, CWD was detected for the first time in wild deer in Montana, south of Billings, actually on the Wyoming border. A couple of mule deer bucks and were detected where it was detected in that, and so they went in and had a special season to try to kill enough deer that they could establish, and then they tested them to establish prevalence to see basically how widespread it was in that part of the state. And they found it in at least one more whitetail, I think one more deer. So based on that, CWD has been creeping northward through Wyoming for years. It looks like it did cross the border into Montana. it is endemic all across southern Saskatchewan and even southeastern Alberta, just north of the border here where I live. So, well, based on that, it's not been knocking on the door for a lot of years. We are we're the focal point for monitoring this year, and the reason I mention it now is I'm pretty sure we've had it and do have it, and so to me the monitoring I think will be a bit anticlimactic because I'm expecting to hear that it's detected in one of the heads that a hunter from this part of the state submits. Um, so I'm kind of treating it a little bit proactively, and I'll give you one example of that is, for years, game agencies, starting in Wisconsin and Midwest, where CWD was first detected in big numbers in whitetails, one of the best practices the game agencies have talked about is disposing of carcasses properly, and really that means not transporting them across state lines, really minimizing the transportation certainly of the brain and spinal tissue. But one of the recommendations is to take them to sanitary landfills, and that always just seemed so wrong to me. One of the things that I've been doing as long as I've been a hunter is returning the carcass to the landscape to kind of complete the life cycle of microbes and return that organic material to the soil. We have on our place what we call, the kids call it Dimitri, but it's really a bastardization of what I used to call it and still do, is the meat tree. We say we're going to go feed Dimitri, and so we'll take carcasses, and basically it's a place where coyotes can kind of feel safe about scavenging, and it's a big old willow tree. Birds will get up in it, and it's just kind of where it's our dumping ground for carcasses after we've butchered them. That doesn't feel so good anymore, feeding Dimitri when in the CWD climate. So starting this year, we're going to be landfillers, and it feels funny, but it really is the right thing to do. And one of the things that people who've lived with CWD a lot longer than we have said is we've got to stop moving deer around, whether it's live deer in the back of horse trailers going from game farm to game farm or hunter killed deer from state to state. That transportation is a real vector for transmitting CWD to new areas. And so I certainly don't want to be a part of that. So Dimitri is going to...
Andrew,
What's that?
would you back up and explain to our listener what CWD actually is and maybe some of the concerns about it?
Yeah, so CWD is one of a member of this Spongiform encephalopathies, which basically means it's a brain disease. It's a misshapen protein called a prion in the brain, and it's as these things get sort of bent, and there's still some question about actually what the mechanism to malform these things. But as they get bent, the brain doesn't function. Basically, it's a little bit like an Alzheimer's effect where there's creeping dementia. And in deer, and this affects whitetail, mule deer, elk, moose, all members of the deer family, they basically get folds in the brain, so that the brain functioning is impaired, and it can start to exhibit itself just with almost like you might see with humans with dementia, of some behavioral changes in its most intense phase. They stumble around. These animals are disoriented. They will become emaciated because they don't eat as well or water as well. It's always fatal. And once you get CWD, you don't get over it. And one of the things that epidemiologists and researchers are looking at is there something about the deer that do get it that is different from those that don't? In other words, is there some sort of immunity or protection that some deer have? That might be sort of the silver bullet to find a cure for this. But the difficult thing is that these prions are not living materials. There's some, and I'm no epidemiologist or forensic, brain researcher, but there's something about their ability to replicate themselves in that brain tissue. So a bent or malformed protein can then make other proteins bent and malformed. The difficult thing is these things can be shed into the environment, so they can stay dormant in the soil or even in vegetation until they are picked up by the next deer. So that's really one of the big reasons we all need to be careful about moving a possibly contaminated deer to a new landscape. Uh, Having those proteins or prions shed into the soil can last far longer than the organic life of the deer that shed them.
So I participated in the Teddy Roosevelt Conservation Partnership Western Media Summit. Boy, that's a long title. Uh, I think it was 2 weeks ago from the time when we're recording this podcast. It was out in Bozeman, Montana, and I moderated a panel about chronic wasting disease. And while I don't consider myself an expert on chronic wasting disease, I've got some pretty good friends that are. So Lou Cornicelli, who works for the Minnesota DNR, is in charge of the research department and the disease efforts in Minnesota. He's done a lot of work here. We've got chronic wasting disease here in Minnesota and a couple other places, and uh, Dr. John Fisher is probably the guy that knows more about chronic wasting disease and animal disease in general in the United States. And he's working out of Georgia, but he's a former Minnesota boy. So it all comes back to Minnesota, guys. But they were at this, but we had a panel and we were talking, and I had Chris Dolnack from the National Shooting Sports Foundation on the panel, and I had the head of wildlife in Montana was on the panel, and I had Dan Forster, who is a former director from Georgia, but he now is government relations for ATA. We were all on the panel, and one of the reasons that they asked us to. Do you want me to drop more names?
Could you drop some more names?
I always cite my sources. It's the scientist in me.
We got the whole bibliography. Thank you.
Well, so here's a production meeting. Go and edit it out if you think I'm dropping too many names. Anyway, so F you guys.
Edit. What's an edit?
Anyway, so we were on this panel, and the whole reason that they had us all together is because there's been a lot of misinformation that's been being spread from within the hunting industry recently by so-called outdoor celebrities and things that are starting to deal with this issue because it's coming to their states or it's affecting their businesses. Some of them have their own deer farms, and there's a lot of restrictions that can happen when CWD happens. Reducing deer populations, reducing movement, requiring hunters, to debone their deer and not move whole carcasses across states. Those are things that affect people. But these are important things. And you hear some conspiracy theories out there. You hear theories that wildlife agencies are doing this because they're somehow making money off of it. There is no money to be made by having chronic wasting disease or scaring hunters that you have chronic wasting disease. It only creates expenses for state wildlife agencies, and it has the threat of scaring some people off from hunting, and that is certainly not what we want to have happen, because it's important that people know chronic wasting disease has never been caught by humans. It doesn't come across from deer to humans yet. Is it possible? Theoretically, it might be possible, but it's not the same as mad cow disease, where humans were infected by the disease and died. It doesn't affect humans. That being said, most rational people don't want to be exposed to the prions if they don't have to be. And we've got places in the country. There's counties in Wisconsin right now that kind of sat on, Wisconsin took a policy where they kind of sat on their hands and didn't do anything about the disease, and now 30 and 40% of their deer herd in some locations, in the hot spots, are infected with chronic wasting disease, and that is a real threat. If that were to occur across the country, first of all, you'd see population reductions. One of the biggest impacts is that it shows up in older deer, and so if you're a guy or gal who's trying to manage their property for mature bucks because you're practicing quality deer management, chronic wasting disease is a real drag on that, because your older bucks tend to be more social, and as they live longer, they're more likely to get exposed and die of chronic wasting disease. So there's some downsides there, but the important thing I think people need to know is nobody is going to benefit from chronic wasting disease, and promoting it is only a matter of education, because we need to take action to reduce its spread. those are important things that are going on, and just because somebody has an outdoor TV show doesn't make them an expert on the topic. It might give them a platform to spread misinformation and complain about the wildlife agencies, but it's important that people be constructive.
I think it's important also to mention the sort of the drag on wildlife agencies. So there's not additional funding that comes with CWD management, monitoring, and managing around it. And so a lot of state wildlife agencies are having to divert funds and resources from other programs to devote to this.
Yeah.
The last thing that agencies need is people denying that it's a problem or suggesting somehow that the agency is profiting from it, because it's by every measure a net drain.
Yeah. Look, if you're the kind of person who thinks that your wildlife agency are idiots, you may have those. There may be idiots in your wildlife agency. They exist. But if you think your agency is a bunch of idiots, and you also think that those idiots are engaged in some grand conspiracy that they have kept hidden from the public and have some, mystic secret society like political power to achieve it, you got to pick one or the other. They're either idiots or they're grand conspiracists, but you can't be both.
Though I think you can hold the idea that they are not only spreading CWD because they are in the pocket of the insurance agents, but they're also busy putting out wolves and mountain lions. So there's an awful lot that they're doing that we don't see. And I think just being a conspirator on top of that really shows that they're getting the job done. I don't know what in the world I'm talking about. I had a great point there, but we might want to edit all of that out.
So do you have stock in a black helicopter company or something?
I just couldn't bring it home. I don't know. It was just a lot of babbling.
Well, my 2 cents on the CWD thing is I know way less than you guys do, so I'll give you my perspective as a hunter and as a person who cares about wildlife. Whatever happens, it seems to me that we got to get it right and get the word out about it, because I've got a family deer camp coming up in a couple weeks, and I need to know what I'm supposed to do. A, and B, if this thing is really a problem, I think we need to get more involved with things like QDMA, who is a third party and who isn't your agency. Whether you like and respect the work of your agency or not, certainly political decisions and decisions about wildlife are better made by an agency than by some other governmental lobby or entity. But if your agency isn't something you're fired up about, then join QDMA and help them get to the bottom of what's going on here. But as an end consumer, I'm most concerned about, frankly, myself. What do you want me to do with my deer this year? And so that would be my call to any of our listeners that, if you're a CWD expert, let's get out the content about, what are people in my neck of the woods to do with their deer this year? It's coming.
So Eric, related to that, I'd also recommend that they go and sign up for the National Deer Alliance. Get on the newsletter there. It's an organization that has all of the deer groups in the country that are involved, all of the national or regional ones. So the Mule Deer Foundation, Quality Deer Management, and Whitetails Unlimited are all part of the National Deer Alliance, and their top priority is working on chronic wasting disease, and they have a weekly free newsletter that they share information and they're engaged. That'd be one place to start. And number two, if your state has testing for chronic wasting disease, take advantage of it. Bring your deer into the check stations and have a sample taken. They take out the lymph nodes. There are ways where you can take the lymph nodes out yourself and send them to labs to have them tested. It costs a little bit of money, but it could be that peace of mind to know that your meat doesn't have any of the prions. But I also recommend the days of eating bone marrow and spinal columns and things in roast are probably, you're better off not doing that. Deboning your animal, because there's more prion located in the inside the bones and the bone marrow and in the nervous system, in spinal columns and stuff, that avoiding those is probably a good idea. Stop eating your deer brains.
I'll give you an indication of kind of its impact and kind of managing around it this year. As I mentioned, we are in a monitoring regime here where there's going to be intensive efforts to collect as many heads as possible and have them tested. It's concurrent with our local sportsman's club is trying to get a mentor hunt going this year, all in the November portion of our deer season. And the way we want it to work is experienced hunters are inviting inexperienced hunters to go out with them and hunt together and then go through all of the stages, not only the stalk and the kill, but also the field dressing and then bringing the deer back and butchering it together. What we would love to do is to be able at the end of that effort to say, here's a whole basket of cut and wrapped venison so that the apprentice can take home and enjoy with their family. CWD has kind of gotten in the way of that a little bit. So we are trying to be very conscious that we expect the first 3/4 of that to go apace. We're going to go out with the mentor and the apprentice. We're going to get deer. We're going to field dress it. We're going to butcher it. But then we need to mark it in a meaningful way and freeze it, and then take the deer head or the lymph nodes to be tested. But until we get that bill of health back, which takes anywhere from 10 days to 2 weeks to say that this deer is not infected with chronic wasting disease, then we can release that deer meat to the apprentice. But until then, we're really trying to just do it right and say we can't enjoy the full fruit of the harvest until we get that clean bill of health back from the department. And I think that's an important thing to be mindful of too. Just take your time. It's a really delayed gratification, I guess, from enjoying all of that delicious deer meat. But I know I have much greater peace of mind knowing that it's come back with a clean bill of health than just wondering, is this an infected deer or not?
Well, fellas, we're running up against the clock here.
Well, in fact, I'm eager to talk in future episodes about how this sort of mentoring experience is going. We're trying to do it county-wide. So I think maybe we talk about mentoring in general, but maybe some more specifics of how to mentor.
Sounds good.
In our next episode.
All right.
Any last words, fellas?
Everything starts with an invite. If I've said it once, I've said it 1,000 times.
Okay,
text somebody now. Invite somebody new to your next hunting trip or to one down the road. All you got to do is invite them and they'll show up.
And we want to hear about it. We want to hear your perspectives on North and South Dakota and your own experience taking somebody new into the field. So until next week, stay on gravel.
Thank you for listening to the On Gravel podcast. We hope you enjoyed today's show. If you did, make sure to drop us a follow and share the podcast with friends and family. Have a great day.